How to make deep progressive house, episode 9, I think. Probably should check that before making the video. If you're new to the series, I'm going to show you how to make deep progressive house music, similar to like Guy J, Hernan Cattaneo, and Dowden, by breaking down some of my recent music. The first track is a higher energy, almost peak time progressive house track. It's the one you're hearing right now in the background. And then the second track is gonna be more melodic, organic. It's a track that I've been playing out at like day parties and boat parties. Actually, here's a video of me playing it in Prague last summer. You can get condensed versions of these project files in the link in the description below, as well as some free checklists, free sample pack, and more. Without further ado, let's get started. First track I have, like I said, is a bit more of a higher energy, almost peak time track. It is a remix I did of a track called Come Home by Zookasm, and it's on Night Colors Recordings, which is a really nice label that I'm definitely paying attention to recently. They're releasing a lot of really great music. The key is in C minor, and the track is 121 beats per minute. So this is how the kick drum sounds. I have 2 layers of the kick, a top, and then the subbier bass, low end of the kick. And what you'll notice here is I have it at -4 because the track is in C minor, but I felt that a kick in C is just not bassy enough. It's a little bit too punchy, a little bit almost like a trance or a side trance kick or a drum and bass kick. So I've lowered that down by 4 semitones, so it's still in C minor scale, and now it sounds much bassier. Adding in some overdrive for some crunch, drum bus for some more crunch and a little bit of limiting, and some EQ. You want to make sure to avoid 4 times filters on the low end like this, because if you have them here, it can cause phase problems and make your bass or your sub sound like fluttery or cause phase cancellation. So I like to use these regular filters and maybe double them up, but just be careful of that. It's really hard to hear, but it can really mess with your low end. Up next, we have the bass, some simple EQ on the bass group itself, pushing up a bit of that crunchiness and grit to get the bass line to cut through. Just helps it punch through the mix a little bit more. Starting with the main sub, the sub bass is a sawtooth wave and a sine wave. The sawtooth is here to add some harmonics and to make it feel very warm. This is the MIDI here with the kick. So then the second oscillator here is just adding a little bit of that extra octave of bass here. I felt it was a bit quiet, and then I'm cutting out the lows because it was a little bit too sub heavy. So I'm just trying to balance the low end to be a little bit more in line with each other, and then some sidechain compression without the EQ, just too subby. So this is balancing it out a little bit. I also changed the bass over here in the climax of the track to make it more melodic. It goes from the C to the D sharp. And that just really elevates the melodic section of the track. We can listen to it all together. Not changing anything else in the track, just the bass line is making that feel much more melodic. So I do that in also the bass top here. Same thing, it follows the same pattern, but I'm using a different synth to add some grit to the bass line. It actually doesn't follow the exact same rhythm as the sub bass, which is something that can be difficult to manage, so just be careful doing this. But I have the bass line here, and I have the sub bass, which is a little bit different, and it just complements the groove and adds kind of like a counter groove to make it even groovier altogether. Very powerful, very chuggy. And to make this, it is a serum patch. This is a preset that I'll be putting on my Patreon page as well. I'm going to be making sample packs and posting them in the near future. And then I have here just 2 of these, some distortion and EQ and filtering. Very simple patch, but very effective. Without processing, very bassy, very heavy. Some EQ to cut out those lows. You'll notice that I'm using a regular filter and a ×4 over here to kind of ease into that to avoid phase problems. Free Clipper here is a free tool. I'll put a link to that in the description below. And basically, it just chops off transients in a way that hopefully doesn't add any distortion. Gives you a bit more headroom and a bit more control over your dynamics. Then I have a multiband dynamics cutting off a lot of that top ending because there has a little bit of a click coming through. So I'm just grabbing that with the compressor. Another EQ, cutting out any of the side information up to about 350 hertz. A compressor, which is adding a nice amount of power to that. Makes it less knocky and more full, and then a delay to add a little bit of dancey movement. It actually adds a bit more groove as well because it's coming in on the beat that's not there in the MIDI. It adds that extra bass hit that's very quiet and it increases that groove a little bit. Lastly, I had a decapitator on here, but it didn't load on my project. I have another bass layer here, very subtle, very simple. It's just a quick ear candy to make the loop not feel so repetitive. And I'm just using a very basic serum patch, 2 wavetables, and a multiband compressor, which is compressing very heavily, and some EQ. It's just there to make the bass line feel not so repetitive by having just a little bit of variation in ear candy. This sound is less of a bass sound and more like a gritty effect sound, but it's really cool. So the way I made this is by adjusting a preset that is a Basic Waves preset pack for Serum. I'll put a link to that in the description below as well. And basically when you hold the note, it creates this really dark hovering sound. And then I change the note, so every time a new note plays, it kind of switches it up to give that nice bit of movement, and then a bunch of reverb from the realm here to make it, you know, more atmospheric and sit back further in the mix. And that's just like a nice little teaser before the drop. I have these bass sounds, which are really cool, and to make these, I actually use something like Shaperbox or Tantra. Track 13 sounds like this. Just another ear candy to make the repetitive bass line not feel so repetitive by breaking up the loop with some different sounds that are only hitting once in a while. And this actually comes from a longer audio clip that sounds like this. I threw an effect called Tantra onto a bass sound and then cycled through some of the presets. So Tantra is a really cool effects plugin, and you can use this, you can use Shaperbox 3, you can use FKFX Influx, which is actually free to download, and you can try out these different presets, and it makes your sounds really cool. And then what you can do is record this sound and then chop it up and use parts of it as part of your grooves or your leads or your bass lines like I did here. So if I listen again one more time, that is just a Tantra. Right, just to add a little bit of spice to that bass line. Last but definitely not least, I have this bass glue. This is one of the most important parts of the bass line because it adds a nice textural glue to the whole bass and makes it feel very dynamic and very interesting and professional. So let's listen to it by itself. Without EQ. And I did this the same way. I grabbed a Tantra, I threw that on there, and I cycled through some presets and settings until I found something that I liked, and I add this to the bassline group and check it out with and without. It's just an ear candy. It's very textural. It's in the background, but it's going to spice up that bass group so much because it's going to keep the listener on their toes and not really knowing what that sound is and just kind of hearing it in the background the whole time without even really picking up on it. And it can really elevate your bass line. Now that you've heard the bass, let's listen to it in the whole mix. Up next, we have the drums. I have some glue compression on the drums, some reverb automation for some build-ups, nothing special. Let's take a listen to them all together. So what you'll notice right away is that there is a lot of high end, a lot of white noisy type sounds, but the hi-hat still really cuts through that mix, and that's what's really important. You want a nice full top end, but you don't want your hi-hats to get buried down. So we're gonna go through this and I'm gonna show you how I did that. First, I have simple hi-hat. There's some swing on the sounds themselves, and I have this little accent hat here. It's much quieter with the velocity turned down. So the first hat plays, then the second one. There is at least 2 layers of hats here, so we actually have 1, 2, 3, and 4. One of them is just the side little accent hat. So I have a punchy hat here, a punchy hat here that I have taken out the front of so that it sounds more like a shaker. These are actually also from one of the Basic Waves packs. I'll put a link to this pack as well in the description below. A nice kind of full bodied hat, and then another shakery one to kind of bulk up the tail end. Another free clip just to grab those transients and make sure that it's not cutting into my limiter too much. And then I have some EQ here because when you add a lot of layers of instruments, sometimes it bulks up the frequencies. So it actually is a pretty sharp hat with so many hats layered up. So I've used this EQ to cut that down. An open hat as well to give more energy. Usually if you want higher energy drums, you can have a brighter or a more splashier hi-hat. 2 layers, some EQ, and some Hass effect to make it nice and wide. Shaker. So the shaker has some nice sidechain compression, and I've just taken a hi-hat and I've made that into a shaker. Added some fade in, moved it over a little bit so it's not hitting the initial transient, and that makes a really nice shaker that's still pretty aggressive sounding and not like, you know, very deep housey, rattly type shaker. It's more white noisy, and it really helps to not feel super swingy and off the grid. But then I have this shaker loop, which does help it stay off the grid. So I have two. One that is on the grid to kind of keep it in line, and then a second one that's way more swingy that's going to add a ton of ear candy. This also comes from one of those packs. So I will usually add one of these to my drums to just add a ton of dynamics and make that drum loop sound super professional. Combining it with a less swingy one, keeps it to the grid. Clap. 2 clap layers. I like to cut off the beginning of my clap sometimes so that it's a bit tighter sounding. Otherwise, it feels like it's a little bit too long. It's like more EDM-y that way, more techno-y that way. I find that taking the initial transient off or 1 or 2 of the instant hits of the claps makes them feel tighter. This is just a percussion kit. These are just playing throughout the track to give it a bit of ear candy to kind of keep the listener on their toes. Lots of reverb just to keep them further back in the mix. Then I have a ride cymbal. This ride is to add some power to the climax of the track and to kind of break up the monotony a little bit. So it's just a simple ride with a really heavy compression from the kick and then cutting out some of those high end. It just needs to be in the background and kind of elevates the drums a bit. You can listen to them with and without the ride. Also helps to glue everything together. Up next, I have some percussion. So we have this cork kit here. These 2 percussion work together. They're kind of a call and response. So one calls, one responses, and it keeps it really groovy and catchy. And the whole mix. Very simple, but very effective. Last but not least, I have 2 more top loops, and these, again, are just to glue the track together, to add some dynamics and variety, and to make it super interesting to the listener, because there's so many layers that you have to be careful with EQing and volumes and stuff, but adding at least 1 or 2 of these percussive loops to your drums can definitely make it sound more professional and interesting. I've EQ'd this one pretty heavily. I just wanted to kind of bulk up the hi-hats a bit. And now, again, all of the drums together in the track. For the synths, since this is a remix, that was a tongue twister, I'm using a lot of the stems from the original track. So I'm using parts of the original track. I like to play as a few of the original stems so that it pays homage to the original so you can identify that it's a remix, but I also like to manipulate those stems quite often so that it's the exact stem they used, but I've changed it to fit my track and made it so that it's not just completely copying what they've done, but still using what they've done. And by the way, I'm now doing live progressive house masterclasses where I sit down over a live session and show you beginning to end how I create a track. We're going to create a track in real time. I've done 3 of these already. You can enroll in those ones and rewatch them online. A link to that will be in the description below. And if you want to sign up for the new masterclasses upcoming, you can join the waiting list, and I'll put a link to that as well in the description. And of course, there's coaching and music production courses in the links there as well. All right, let's jump back to the song. So a perfect example of this is this arpeggio right here actually sounds much different than what I've played in the track. So if I play this arp by itself, it sounds like this. After I've added some of my own processing, which is reverbs and delays, and I've actually cut up the sound and pitched the notes differently. So I've cut up just a couple of those hits, added a bunch of delay, and I've pitched that up an octave. Then on the second phrasing, I've pitched it up an octave but taken it down 1 full tone. And then the last ones, I've put only up a 5th. So we get this really nice melody by using an arp that was only atonal before. I've created a melody for my track using the atonal stems of the original. Which I think sounds beautiful. I've added a lower octave of this. Which bulks up the sound and makes it cut through the mix a bit more and makes it warmer, sounding more full. And I've done this again later in the track with this main synth. So that's the original, and then I've just taken a section of that and repeated it in the main drop and added some filtering to it and some delay to it to make it more atmospheric, which is going to push it further back in the mix. It feels more atmospheric and less of a lead and more of like a pad type sound, and I think that really complements the drop to feeling something more atmospheric and melodic and less driving. I've sprinkled some atmospheres around the track to make it more melodic and atmospheric. I do this by recording some of the sounds that I have or using atmospheres from sample packs and stretching them to be longer. So if you have this warped, you can hold shift and actually stretch this out, and it makes it longer and a bit more like kind of dark and mysterious. And then I have some vocals from the original. So I love these vocals, but I use them a little bit differently than the original. So I use them as a way to kind of complement the melody of the climax. Lots of delay. I just think it adds a really nice atmosphere as well. Another vocal here. Just some ear candy, using it as like an impact, like it's an effect, but it's actually a vocal. And I like repurposing things like this because, especially if it's within the same realm of the sound, like using a vocal impact in a track that has vocals makes sense because then it's the same realm of sounds and it should fit together really well. A drone is always a good idea for tracks like this because it glues all the melody together. So very simple. And to make something like this, you just have to record a vocal with a bunch of reverb, freeze it. I actually have a video for that. I'll put a link to it up in the corner right here. Really great for progressive tracks like this. Last but not least for this one, this is a really cool trick. I actually am using a recording of people talking in the background and then automating their volume of their voice and adding a delay on it. This is a way to add a lot of ear candy, especially in a very subconscious, subtle way. So if I play this, you'll just hear random people kind of like whispering and talking, and there's so much reverb on it that you don't really hear it, but it's just adding variation to the whole track. I put this in almost every one of my tracks, and then I change the samples or I change the audio, change the pitch. It's just a really cool way of adding that nice little ear candy that you won't even know is there, but it does make the track feel much more subconsciously interesting. If you want to download or stream this track, I'll put a link to that in the corner. But for now, let's move on to the next track, which is called An Owl's Flight, and that's released on Humidas Recordings. This track is lower energy than the last one. It's more organic house inspired, and it was a really good track to play out for like summer vibes, boat parties, things like that. The track is 120 beats per minute, and the key is D, but the mode is Dorian, which just basically means that it is in a different version of the scale, and that is giving it a more of a whimsical kind of day progressive house, more happy, uplifting vibe. Kick drum is 2 layers, top and a bottom. I've pushed this up 1 semitone to be in key, added a little bit of punchiness, just some simple EQing, compression, and drum bus. And I love using drum bus, and just using like 10 to 30% on a drum bus on a kick can make it feel more bulky because it has a limiter and a saturator. Great tool to use on that. Let's take a listen to the bass line. For the sub bass, 2 sine waves with a little bit of color added from compression and from the filtering, adding a bit of drive. Sidechain from the kick, very basic, and you've already seen what the MIDI looks like. Nice and powerful, simple. We'll move on to the bass accent. The bass accent is where all the color comes from in the bass, so I'll turn the EQs off. You can hear what it sounds like without. Another bass preset from the basic waves pack I mentioned earlier. And this one actually is pretty cool because it uses a bit of automation to control the sustain. The sustain is actually opening up and then dropping down, and that gives that kind of like wafting sound. So it opens up that sustain on the synth, and that holds open the filter for a little bit, and then closes, so it's like bow. You get that cool sound. Just something simple to create a little bit of movement in the bass line can go a long way because it'll sound much more interesting for a longer period of time, even if it's something super subtle like this. With the EQ on, we're cutting out all those lows and most of the highs. Combining that with a couple more accents here. So this is a little bit less gritty, a little bit more full with both. Another accent here. So this is a pretty heavy one. This one is to add a bit of variation so that the loop, it doesn't feel like a 4-beat loop, because over 8 or 16 or even 32 beats, I have these little stabs and stuff that are changing or different, and it makes that loop feel much longer and not so repetitive. This is another pluck by that same pack. and then just playing that MIDI to kind of jump around a little bit and play differently. And the processing is just some EQ and some compression. Last two sounds I have is this Pigments works as like a bass glue. So some reverb, which is actually not usually advised for basses, but I've used a mid-side EQ to cut out the sides below a certain point. And again, this is just there to add a bit of grit, a bit of glue to the bass, sidechain from the kick as well as from the bass accent. So when this bass accent kicks in, it turns down that kind of glued sound so that that bass accent really cuts through the mix and doesn't get clouded up with multiple layers overlapping each other in the low mids of the track. This preset was one that I made called Nice Bass Pluck Top. Pretty self-explanatory name. And then last but not least, I have this WOM sound. It's just a very simple preset that I've made inside of Wavetable with some higher attack, high release, some EQing out the lows and the highs, and then a big old reverb tail. All together, the bass sounds like this with the kick. Up next, we have the drums. The first sound I have here is a same Pigments preset as I used for the bass, but instead I changed it to a white noise, and then I used some auto pan and some Haas effect to make it really wide and interesting. Basically, it's using a filter to kind of open and close to create that kind of wafting effect with the white noise, which sounds really interesting in the background of the drum loop and makes it very dynamic. Next, we have the hi-hat. I won't go over it too much, but we have 4 layers. So this layer is adding a bit of tail to the end of the hi-hat to make it feel like an open hat without sounding too tech housey. A lot of the open hats are very big and very like, they're just too much. So I like to grab just the tail end of some nicer open hats and add that to the hat that I already have. And that makes it feel like an open hat without being overbearing. And the MIDI for this is very similar to the other one. We have the main hat and then just some accent hats very quietly in the background. Processing is very simple, just some EQ, limiting, maybe some saturation, and it looks like some compression at the end. When layering up multiple hats like this, it can get pretty loud and pretty bulky, so you have to be careful by EQing and compressing so that it doesn't get too intense in the mix. This percussion is really nice and adds a lot of value to the loop. Doesn't sound like much, but when you listen with the kick and the rest of the drums, it really keeps that call and response going. Adds that really nice rhythmic hypnotizing call and response. Next is the drum loop, like I mentioned before, to add that extra level of complexity. I've really EQ'd it out to get rid of those percussion. Added a wider to make it nice and wide, and then a vocoder to make it really white noisy. The white noise is actually pretty subtle, and then a hi-hat compressor. So when the hi-hat hits, it's actually squishing down this one just like a kick and bass would, and cutting room for that track to play the hi-hat through the shaker loop so that the hi-hat doesn't get buried by it. Clap, we don't need to go over. Very simple, just 2 layers of clap. Really nice crispy sounding clap, cutting out some of the EQ because this actually makes it sound more like a bite. More like, so I took some of that out and it feels a bit better in the mix. Oh, and then I have infinity EQ on the end of the channel, which is just using the dynamic mode. If you're familiar with Pro Q3, it's very similar to that EQ. Basically has a dynamic EQ, which will adjust based on how loud something is and won't just be the exact same cut every single time. So that's infinity EQ, and that's by Slate Digital. Another shaker loop here. This one is more percussive, and I used this in a way by reducing so much of the frequencies with EQ that it sits really nicely in the mix. I found it a bit resonant, so that's why I took this one here to get rid of that sharp bell. And then this EQ here gets rid of most of the frequencies, but it sits it really far in the back in the mix, but it just adds a really nice textural glue to the drum loop. It's like really hard for your ear to pick up on what you're listening to, but it sounds really nice. And then a clave down here, which I think also accents the groove quite nicely. One more time, we'll listen to the drums with the kick and the bass. When we go into the synths, I have a really cool story about this track, and it takes part in the synths. Basically, when I was writing this track, a pigeon flew outside my window into the trees in front of my studio window and started cooing kind of along to the music, and it was in key with the track, and I thought that was really neat. So I went online and I grabbed a sample of, well, not a pigeon, but an owl, and I grabbed that owl, sorry pigeon, and I threw that into the track and made that part of the groove, made it part of the like the melodic structure of the track. And I did this with 2 different sounds. So I have this owl down here, and that plays as part of like the melody, and it works with part of the groove. And I have another one that hits right before the drop, and it sounds like this. I don't think it's actually an owl. I think it's actually a loon, which is a really respected Canadian animal. And that's like one of the main hooks of the track. Now you can listen to that owl with the rest of the mix. Right? It adds so much to that groove. I thought it was a really cool way of adding a real organic sound into the loop to make it really groovy and interesting. For the rest of the track, I have these lead sounds that I just jammed along. So I like to play the track and set up a synth with a bunch of delay and intentionally play a little bit off timing in live so that I can record how I'm feeling when I'm jamming. So I'll play along the track and I'll literally just jam along to this. I'll hit record and I'll just see how it sounds. And I'll do this a few times until I get what I really like. So if you look, the MIDI is all over the place in terms of quantization. And that's if I turn the delay off and the reverb, it's a bit more off timing. So what I'll do is I'll use a delay and reverb to kind of mask the random notes, and then I'll record it live. I'll quantize it a little bit if it's too far off, but playing it kind of randomly and listening to the delay and not really knowing when is the original note and when is the delayed note can make it sound very, very organic, very ambient, very atmospheric, and it gives a very realistic, organic feel to the track, and it just pours my soul into the track a bit more when I play along live as opposed to just programming stuff in. I highly recommend it. You can see it gets pretty crazy here. Like right, like the MIDI doesn't even really make sense, but it builds and builds and builds and makes these big atmospheric sounds. I did that again here. It's just lots of reverb, lots of delay. You can actually use an arpeggiator at the beginning, and if you use an arpeggiator, it'll keep it in time if you set it to 16ths. So even if you're off time, it'll shift it into time as well, which is really cool. And I just made a preset called Rhythmic Plex. You'll grab this in the project files on my Patreon as well. Very simple patch, but it works really well. Some extra ear candy down here using a preset called Centipad, and this is just adding a little bit more melodic flavor, right? These random notes just keep the listener engaged by playing random atmospheres that they don't know are really coming. I have another one here, literally just a sawtooth wave with a long attack, long release, some unison, EQing the crap out of the low end, adding a bit of distortion with this free Camel Crusher plugin, and then a bunch of reverb, another reverb, Valhalla Shimmer, wider, and auto pan. This is a huge atmospheric sound, and it's just there to, again, keep the listener engaged by putting in these random sounds that are just increasing the melodic aspect of the track. Adds tension. I have some vocal swells here. These are from maybe vocal packs, and what I do is I place these in here with a really big reverb, sometimes multiple reverbs. Right, this doesn't even sound good on its own, but you reverb that biat cha up. Now you have this big atmosphere. And what else I'll do is I'll change the pitch of these, so you can grab the same sample and change the pitch, and then it sounds like a new sound. You can also stretch, make them shorter or smaller to kind of make the same vocal sample sound different, especially when adding a bunch of reverb and delay. There's some more vocal swells down here. And last but not least, we have the piano. This is the heart and soul of this track. This is the MIDI for the piano. It's very simple, but it's very beautiful. Just 2 notes on each chord, except for this one. And what I'm doing is I'm slowly opening up the filter of that to make it more interesting as it's building. And I really have this filter. There's some delay, of course, and some reverb, but then I have another layer of this piano lead, the exact same MIDI, but this one is probably a little bit a different swing. I'll put some of the notes a little bit differently so that they sound like there's two instruments playing at the same time, makes it more humanized. And then I have the same notes, but this is a completely different sound. It's more percussive. It's a Pigments preset, and it sounds like this. So it's a preset called Really Long Keys. I've turned off all the effects. And then also this one is opening up in the filter, and it sounds like this when it's fully open. Or almost fully open. Combine them together. Nice snare roll with some delay. So if you enjoyed this video and you want to check out more videos like this one, click this playlist right here, or you can check this video right here, which YouTube thinks you'll like based on your personal algorithm.